All right, good afternoon and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for an update on all events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. Now with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey. Good evening from Israel. We're going to focus much of tonight's talk, excuse me, on what was described as a media blitz by Prime Minister Naftali Bennett in the weekend's newspapers last weekend. It's the first time since he took over the job around 8 months ago that he's really devoted significant time to the media, to getting his messages across, talking about his achievements, talking about his challenges. And he didn't just choose one or two, or even just one. He gave 6 major interviews. Obviously, here in Israel, the Friday papers are the most significant, the weekend papers, for those who are more observant of the Jewish Sabbath. You know, the actual print publications are very important because you're not online or watching TV or listening to the radio or whatever it is. So these are always the most sought after papers of the week. And there's a lot to pass through in the many interviews. A lot of them are the sort of expected stuff, attacking Netanyahu, his predecessor, for his, what he calls a propaganda of lies, sending his emissaries out to attack him, and et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of interesting stuff about his positions vis-a-vis Iran, Palestinians. Coronavirus got a lot of play because that's a major issue, and there's a lack of confidence, let's say, certainly a lack of support in what this current government is doing on the Omicron wave. I think this week, per capita, Israel had one of the largest infection rates in the world, even if they don't have very high, sort of applicable death rates, fatality rates, although this week there's been around 50 deaths every day, which is extremely high, but on the whole, not in line with the actual infection rates. And some say they were slow, some say they were confusing orders. This day, one message or one decision was made, the next day something else. So he got a lot of play on that, a lot of pushback from some of the interviewers. The first thing I want to talk about is why he decided to give them now. I think a big part of it's connected to the Netanyahu plea bargain, the so-called Big Bang that we've spoken about in the last few weeks. It's now not happening. It's been put on the back burner. I think it won't be put back on the front burner, as it were, for a good few months, if not half a year. They still haven't decided on a new Attorney General. I think it's been narrowed down to 3, but the discussions are going on. There is an interim Attorney General, but they're not going to make any major decisions. And then when a new Attorney General is appointed, they're going to need a lot of time to catch up, to learn the case inside and out. And obviously the Netanyahu lawyers will be looking and studying also the new Attorney General to see what direction they're going in, whether it's worth an outreach, whether they can get a better deal, which I doubt, than they had possibly on the table with Mandelblit. So to a certain extent, Israeli politics is back where it was a month ago before even there's talk of a plea bargain. There's a lot of talk about the timing of that. Did Bennett know that the plea bargain was now taken on the table? Did he do the media blitz thinking that plea bargain could be on the table, and this government may have had weeks, if not only a few months, to exist? I think it's a combination of things. I think the suggestions or the possibility of Netanyahu leaving politics for a while certainly played into that. I think the fact that his approval rating, according to one poll at least, was as low as 4%. Again, it's not like in the US where it's just sort of, do you like or not? It's they put them up against various other figures. In Israel, sometimes it'd be 7, 8, 9, 10 other figures. So 4% is not as, it's low, but it's not, it's not a one-on-one race where the other person gets 96 or something like that, or the disapproval, the disapproval was 96%. It's not as simple as that, but it's still very low. And obviously the Omicron and the economy and everything going on with that certainly didn't help. But what was interesting about it, there was a number of things that was interesting. Many people focused on some comments that he made, where again he tried to justify, his right-wing positions. He stressed in all his interviews, "I'm still a right-wing man. I still believe in everything I believed in before. I still am against the Palestinian state. I will not meet with Abu Mazen. I will not meet with anyone who's taking IDF soldiers to The Hague, the ICC, despite the fact that other members of the cabinet are." He said that there'll be no Oslo process, unlike in his predecessor's time, alluding to Netanyahu, who had met with Mahmoud Abbas and other senior Palestinian leaders, had allowed a peace process, a diplomatic process to happen various times during his tenure. And he really tried to push his right-wing credentials, admitting that it's a difficult government to govern because there are different elements with people who disagree with him. And, they have their meetings, they have their ideologies, they have their own narrative, but there's going to be no practical purpose. He talked about the fact that he said no to US President Biden on the US consulate issue in Jerusalem. He played this up. He said, I'm more right-wing, I've been building more. And now at the moment, today, Avichai Mandelblit, on pretty much his last decision, allowed for the establishment, at least posed no problems or challenges to the establishment of a new outpost, Eviatar, which is a big bone of contention within the government that could also bring up some issues. But what he did say, which was interesting, is that he is the head of a new national camp. National camp in Israel means the right-wing camp. The left-wing is usually called the Davish camp or the peace camp. The national camp usually signifies the right-wing. And what a lot of commentators were trying to get out of that is that there is talk, the assessments claimed, that Bennett is trying to put his Yamina party with Gideon Saar's New Hope party and Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beitenu party together to create a new right-wing party that could challenge the Likud. This is what a lot of people were talking about. My particular view is it was something less than that. I don't believe that there will be this new party. I think what he was trying to say is that there's a significant national camp within this alternative government, and that it's significant enough and it's leading the state. I think his argument would be that he's done a lot more right-wing things even than the previous so-called right-wing governments. That's his argument. And while I'm sure that there have been talks, have been certain people interested in putting together a larger party, I don't believe it will happen for a number of factors. For Naftali Bennett, it makes sense because he really hasn't made that many inroads since he's been prime minister to try and boost his numbers. His numbers, when it comes down to how much percentage he would get in the next elections, how many seats, has not expanded. He's pretty much lost most of his right-wing base, his right-wing religious base. He's brought in some more moderate right-wing, but he's probably lost his base. So I think he understands that. So maybe for him, it makes sense. Even for Gideon Saar, whose polling numbers have really dropped, and in certain polls, he's not even reaching the threshold, which means if elections were held today, he wouldn't necessarily even pass the threshold and gain any Knesset seats. For Avigdor Lieberman, it makes less sense, and the reasons are multiple. First of all, Avigdor Lieberman, as opposed to the other two, has a solid base. When I say solid, we're talking about 5 to 6 minimum of old Russian-speaking Israelis that he can count on. He's ensuring, no matter what, that he will look after that base. And if he can get another seat or two, that's an added bonus. Naftali Bennett, as I said, has lost his base. Gideon Saar never really captured a base, and whatever base he had seems to have deserted him, perhaps returned to the Likud, according to the polls. But also, Avigdor Lieberman has been burnt by this sort of coming together of other parties. There was a time, it was, I think, if I'm not much mistaken, 2013, where Likud and Yisrael Beitenu ran together. That was mostly on the advice of American strategist Arthur Finkelstein, who worked with both Netanyahu and Lieberman and was trusted by both. And he came up with these numbers that together the parties would have 45 seats, returning to the days where there'd be one supremely large party. And that's what the two parties sort of ran on. They believed that together they could become one larger party. In the end, they actually slumped to a pretty meager 31. And I certainly think that burnt Avigdor Lieberman, and it also sent a message wider in Israeli politics on the whole that a sum of your parts, you're never as strong together as the sum of your parts, because again, Avigdor Lieberman and Naftali Bennett and Gideon Sa'ar may be close on diplomatic issues or political issues or security issues, but on other issues, for example, religion and state, which is a major issue at the moment, they're much further apart. You've got the hawkish members of Yamina on religion and state issues, whereas Yisrael Beitenu is far more dovish on religion and state issues. What I mean by that is wants to reform things like kashrut, conversion, the Kotel compromise, things like that. They're much closer to Yesh Atid's positions on those. So I think it would be very unwieldy to have these parties together. And again, they can agree on certain things and disagree on other things while they're separate parties, but together it's far more difficult to formulate a common stance across the board. So I don't see that happening. I could be wrong, but I just don't think it will happen, because again, you'd have to put the egos aside. They're being burned. Where is their base? Because if for example, Avigdor Lieberman comes in, maybe some of the more traditionally based supporters of Naftali Bennett would then be turned off and move to another party, and vice versa. So again, I just don't see that happening. But I think what Bennett was trying to say is that he is, his government that he's leading has a significant right-wing camp in it, and they are getting some things done, obviously not everything. And he underlined the fact that he's not able to achieve everything he's able to achieve. But I think that's more likely than anything else. So I don't see necessarily the formation of a new party. Obviously, there's a certain amount of time until elections, so one never knows. Another very interesting element, and it's significant, is that one of the papers that he went to and gave a very long, a lengthy interview was Yisrael Hayom. Yisrael Hayom, for those who aren't familiar, is the largest, has the largest circulation in Israel of any paper, primarily because it's free. It's given out on every street corner, shops and restaurants or whatever. So it has a very large circulation. It was created by Sheldon Adelson and basically became what many claimed, at least, was a mouthpiece for Netanyahu. It even gained the nickname Bibi Ton, playing on Netanyahu's nickname, and Eton, which is newspaper. Something obviously the paper itself rejected. But interestingly, Sheldon Adelson passed away a number of months ago, and his widow, Miriam Adelson, has taken over at the paper. And it seems like she's a lot more angry over Netanyahu's attitude towards the paper. And that's what part of the Netanyahu criminal case is, that he said that he would stop Yisrael Hayom from having a Friday edition, which hurt its main rival, Yediot Achronot, in a deal with Yediot Achronot to give more favorable coverage. I think that's the Case 2000. That's a large part of Case 2000. And Adelson's was certainly not happy about it at the time, but a lot more information has come out during the court case. And it's said that Miriam Adelson certainly feels a lot more bitter towards the whole experience than her late husband did. What we saw this week was that the editor, Boaz Bismuth, resigned at the position, or who knows, was asked to leave the position. Boaz Bismuth was very much in the Netanyahu camp, was very much a loyalist to the Netanyahu narrative and Donald Trump as well. The fact that he's been replaced has led to a lot of suggestions that the paper is going to start moving towards Naftali Bennett. That apparently Miriam Adelson is a lot more sympathetic to Bennett. Don't forget, Bennett was attacked many times in the past, as all of Netanyahu's allies were. And if Bennett could become the benefactor of this new change in direction towards him from the largest circulated paper in the country, that could be highly significant. There are those who say that it's happening, and a lot of people point to the relatively sympathetic interview he received from Yisrael Ayom, whereas probably he wouldn't have received such a sympathetic one previously. So there's a lot of talk around that. And although it may seem relatively insignificant, it can be possibly extremely significant. I would like to hear any questions that you may have on any of these subjects or anything else that's happened this week.
Okay, thank you so much. We have quite a few questions coming in. The first one from an anonymous attendee is, what are the odds of an election being held in the near future? And if so, what party is likely to win?
Well, the first question I would say, I think it's unlikely. One never knows. I think that now that Avichai Mandelblit has left the Attorney General's office, the plea bargain has certainly been put off for a number of months, if not up to, as I said, half a year, if even the person who comes in, we don't know who that will be, but it's suspected that Netanyahu probably won't get as good a deal as he would have under Mandelblit. So perhaps the whole issue is off the table, which means Netanyahu remains as leader of the opposition for now, which also means that this government still retains the significance of being that anti-sort of Bibi coalition. Some argue that the only glue of this coalition is the fact that it doesn't trust Netanyahu on many different levels. So I think at the moment, I don't see elections happening in the immediate near future. And as far as who's going to win, well, as we talked about before, no one really wins. No one party wins Israeli elections because it's about their share of the Knesset. And usually, what happens is that who wins the election usually happens in negotiations after that. The numbers are not drastically changing from poll to poll. The Likud has certainly gained a few of its seats, perhaps, as I said earlier, at the cost of New Hope, Gideon Saar's party. But the numbers, the overall mathematics hasn't changed. What actually most polls have said that neither bloc will have a majority. And the reason for that is because the United Arab list will have 6 or 7 seats, maybe even 8. So neither side could form a government without them, and they won't sit with either side. It's one thing for Mansour Abbas's Ram party, who has for a while been, reaching out or reached out to, but no one will sit with the United Arab list. So at the moment, we could be, if there were elections today, and the results of the polls would be the actual results, we could just be going for a subsequent number of elections after that.
Thank you. And Eric asks, is there any scenario where the religious movement will lose some of its power in Israeli society?
When he says religious movement, I'm not clear exactly what he means, but I'm going to assume the ultra-Orthodox parties. It has lost power because it's in the opposition, and everything that's happening now in religion and state, certainly to its detriment. It's had a monopoly over kashrut, kosher standards in restaurants and hotels, etc. It's losing its monopoly on conversions, although the chief rabbinate is trying to fight that tooth and nail. It lost this week with the passage of the first reading of the Enlistment Bill. This is something which ostensibly, if one remembers back to that, after that first elections, before merry-go-round of elections, Yisrael Beitenu, Victor Lehman's party, said that they wouldn't join a government that wouldn't pass this law. And this law would require a greater number of ultra-Orthodox to serve in the army or do national service and increase the numbers every year. But so if this law actually passed at the second time of counting, at least it passed its first reading. Well, obviously, it's got a bit of a way to go, but it's something which the ultra-Orthodox certainly fought against. Truthfully, behind closed doors, it's not a great impediment for them. They fight it tooth and nail publicly, and they claim it's a destruction of Jewish learning in the state of Israel. But behind closed doors, and I've spoken to a number of people involved with these parties, they're not afraid of the law. They even sort of laugh a little bit. I've even heard some members of Knesset from the ultra-Orthodox parties laugh that this is the great thing that they're going to do. It's not significant enough for them. But certainly they don't like to be in the opposition. They need to be empowered. They need to be closer to decision-making for the budgets for their yeshivot, or whether it's for these decisions. They want to fight every reform because they take a maximalist position on issues of religion and state. So certainly it's hurting them. But as I said, with the dynamics as they are in Israeli politics, the ultra-Orthodox are always an attractive partner for any bloc, whether it's left or right, because they don't have firm positions on certain key issues like the diplomatic or security issues. As long as they get their budgets, they get control over certain ministries, whether it's religious affairs or interior. So they're suffering. They want to be in the coalition, but at the moment they're being kept out. But they're probably, if it will expand, they're certainly one of the favorites to join. But there's still a lot of opposition from within the government from that happening.
Thank you. From Lynn Levin, how much influence can Netanyahu have in the near future in Israeli politics?
Massive influence. Even in opposition, as I said, so much pivots around him. If this government, as I said, if Netanyahu were to take a plea bargain, were to resign from public life or resign from the Likud, it would be it would be the Big Bang. So as long as he's there, the government stays for the time being. They will have internal elections in the Likud by the end of the year, but at the moment he would be expected to win, especially as his opposition is not focused on one person. It's unlikely that anyone will rally around one particular opponent. There's lots of people who see themselves as future heads of the Likud. So I think his position at the moment is safe. He doesn't have much say, on day-to-day governance, obviously, because he's in the opposition. They make a lot of noise. There's a lot of attacks on Bennett and the government and Lapid and Lieberman and Saar from his camp, but that's noise. That's rhetoric. If they can, stymie a vote here, a bill there, then that's a win for them. But at the end of the day, it's about making noise from his side.
Thank you. And changing gears a little bit, Rabbi Joel Schwartzman asks, most attention in the American Jewish community has been focused on Amnesty International's libelous report accusing Israel of being an apartheid state. Is there similar outrage in Israel apart from the comments coming from Lapid?
I think amongst the average Israeli, no, it's not a big news item. It certainly didn't lead the news. It's more in sort of, foreign policy circles, people who read the international media. It's been known for a while in these sort of circles that there is a coordinated and concerted approach to try and frame Israel as an apartheid state. The case obviously can't be made, and it hasn't been made, but the terminology is there. I read the report before it was released, and it was all over the title, it was all over the opening paragraphs, but the case simply wasn't even made seriously. But it's part of the propaganda war against Israel. It's the attempt to delegitimize Israel, to make it the pariah state. And, they tried in the past to try and say Israel was Nazis, and they understood that didn't work because of, obviously, the historic connection with the Holocaust. But apartheid they've understood that it's a good frame of reference because a lot of the people that are reading it, especially the sort of so-called millennials and a little bit older, don't remember apartheid South Africa. They just know it's bad, it's racist, it's wrong. But it's a good framing from their point of view because it certainly frames Israel as an evil state, probably uniquely evil, even though Amnesty had called Myanmar apartheid. I'm not sure if they called them apartheid or said some of their actions and policies. They claim that's why they didn't single out Israel. It's clear from the fact that Human Rights Watch used it, Amnesty uses it, these anti-Israel organizations, BDS movement has used it. So it's clearly part of a concerted, coordinated attempt to label Israel. But there was a lot of pushback, coordinated to a certain extent from the Jewish world, the Zionist world. And that's where it plays out. It plays out in the sort of ideological sphere. But in Israel, the average Israeli is not concerned, it's not involved, doesn't really care about these sort of things. It doesn't affect them on a day-to-day basis or even on a wider basis. But obviously in foreign policy circles, in the foreign ministry, it is a concern because there is the fear that eventually could start catching on and sort of be equated, as it was by some, to the infamous, I should say, UN resolution equating Zionism with racism. This is the sort of modern attempt to equate Israel as an apartheid state, as a state that shouldn't, can't be justified. It was born in sin and should disappear, as many would like it. So that's certainly a worry in foreign policy circles in Israel, but amongst the average Israeli, very, very little.
Thank you. Robert Larrick asks, what do you think of Israel participating with naval drills with the U.S., Oman, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia for the first time, as he understands it?
Well, it goes back, there's been a lot of coordination. There's not any open drills with some of these countries. But there's certainly a lot of below the surface coordination. This week, in fact, it was considered quite historic, but I guess today it's, with everything that's happened, perhaps it's lost some of its resonance. We had an Israeli president, the head of state of the Jewish state, the Jewish and democratic state, fly over Saudi Arabian airspace openly and publicly. That was considered very historic. And certainly, if someone would have said that a few years ago, you would have said it's impossible, especially not with movement on the diplomatic, the Palestinian issue. But the fact is, these things are happening today. So an open public military drills with some of these countries, we're not quite there yet. But I don't think we're a million miles away from maybe something more open. There's a lot of talk and a lot of sort of bets on who would be the next country. Qatar came out. I don't think Qatar were necessarily at the top of the list anyway, but they came out and said, there's nothing doing for us because, there's nothing doing on the Palestinian front. There's talk about Indonesia, perhaps. There's talk about Oman. Oman obviously actually hosted former Prime Minister Netanyahu. So again, we're talking about countries who are having more open steps towards Israel. So this is certainly positive developments.
Thank you. Well, we're on the military side of things here. Jacob Hirschman asks, in the last few days, Bennett has been referring to a laser shield that should be implemented in the next 12 months or so. Is this real?
From what I understand, and I'm certainly no military expert, it is real. Whether it's going to be implemented in the next 12 months, there's a lot of people who say it will take a lot longer than that. What he talked about is this sort of laser system that would surround Israel, that would be able to shoot down missiles on all of its fronts. What's significant about this is because it would change the dynamic, the sort of missiles that are thrown into Israel at the moment, especially from Gaza. I said launch, not thrown. Are relatively cheap, but Israel's Iron Dome costs something like $50,000 a battery. And obviously, the idea is for Hamas to exhaust Israel financially or whatever it is. And, we get a lot of the funding from the US. But if we look at what Hezbollah have on the northern front, it has something like 7 times the amount of rockets, more precision, longer range. And quite simply, it would be exorbitant to try and fight off these sort of batteries. Also, Hamas found ways around Iron Dome when they've fired dozens at a time. Sometimes, very rudimentary rockets that Iron Dome doesn't shoot down. So this new system that Bennett proudly touted apparently will be much cheaper, cost a few dollars per laser, as it were. And the Hamas rockets are getting more and more expensive, let alone the Hezbollah ones. So it changed the dynamic there. But a lot of military experts have said that he's being overly optimistic that it'll be ready in 12 months. The system's being tried out on drones and other systems, but to have it surrounding Israel within 12 months, again, I'm not an expert. I can't give anything behind the scenes on this, but a lot of commentators have come out and said, yes, eventually we could have something like that in several years, not the 1 to 2 year timeline that Prime Minister Bennett talked about this week.
Thank you so much. And one last question from Carrie Hillebrand. Recently, Israel announced the planned procurement of several million Novavax COVID vaccines. Does this represent a no confidence in the Israeli-developed Brie-Life vaccine that is approaching approval?
To the best of my knowledge, it's not that close to approval. We're talking about an old school vaccine in Israel. Actually, they're trying to be a sort of hybrid between the new style vaccine and the old style vaccine. I don't think that we'll be able to develop it at the speed and the numbers of some of the more international brands. There's been a lot of controversy surrounding that. There's that the people behind the Israeli vaccine have said that they were stymied after a great publicity under Netanyahu. Then the money wasn't there and the assistance wasn't there, as opposed to some of the other global brands that received assistance from international governments. The fact that we've been using Pfizer all this time, and we continue to use Pfizer and even some Moderna and some of this. I wouldn't say it doesn't show any confidence in the Israeli one, but the fact is, you need to take what's on the market now rather than wait. Who knows how long it will take, and the efficacy and everything else. If when it's released, if we can see high efficacy, if it's cheaper, if it's whatever it is, longer term, that's the secret today. It's not so much the efficacy, it's whether it can last long term, because we've seen all the major RNA vaccines are very effective, but in the short term, they're not lasting as long as everybody would hope. So if the Israeli one could show that it has high efficacy and longer term solutions, then I'm sure the Israeli government will go with it. But it seems like coronavirus is here to stay. So you have to take whatever's out there, because coronavirus is with us yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And unfortunately, you can't wait for a few months' time to see what may be. So I think it's more about that than anything else.
All right, thank you so much. Well, we've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you so much for taking time to update us this week.
Thank you.
And for our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Dr. Walid Fares. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.